Over 23 publishers rejected Dune before a small company known for printing car manuals finally took a chance on it. And yet, this sci-fi novel sold over 20 million copies and shaped the genre forever. But the journey to bring Dune to the big screen was just as challenging, with failed attempts, massive visions, and countless obstacles. So, how did Dune finally become the epic film we see today? Let's dive into the incredible story behind one of the most iconic adaptations in sci-fi history. Before we get into the film, let's start with some background information on the book itself. Dune wasn't exactly an easy novel to sell at first. Publishers rejected it and no one was willing to take a chance. Even when a publisher finally picked it up, the agents were skeptical and didn't believe the book would sell well. Nevertheless, it ended up being published by Chilton, a small Philadelphia-based firm known for printing car manuals. If you've set foot into any auto parts store in the last 50 years, you've definitely seen stacks of them for sale behind the counter, and maybe even used one on a DIY parts install. It's funny to think that a company focused on car repair guides was the one to take a risk on what would become one of the greatest sci-fi novels ever written. Although Dune had become a popular novel, turning it into a movie was far from easy. Over the years, many filmmakers tried to make the story to life, but one of the earliest and boldest attempts came in the 1970s. Alejandro Jodorowsky, a Chilean-French director known for his surreal and experimental films, had incredibly ambitious plans for a 14-hour-long adaptation. He wanted to give audiences a massive, surreal experience, but the project fell apart due to a lack of funding. Jodorowsky's vision was so influential, even though it never made it to the screen, that it became the subject of the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune. Dune did make it to the screen in 1984, directed by David Lynch. However, most fans and critics agree that Lynch's version fell short of capturing the depth and complexity of Herbert's epic saga. By the time the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter movies proved that long, complicated books could be successfully adapted, there was renewed hope for Dune, but more setbacks followed. Paramount Pictures held the rights for a while, bringing on various directors and making big promises, but once again, the project collapsed in 2011. So, who finally managed to bring Dune to life after so many failed attempts by others? In 2011, Mary Parent, a seasoned Hollywood producer known for her work on major films like The Revenant, and her producing partner Cale Boyder, acquired the adaptation rights for Dune, setting the stage for what would become the film we know today. Legendary Pictures, a prominent production company behind massively successful blockbusters like Jurassic World and The Dark Knight, eventually secured the film and TV rights in November 2016. By this time, Denis Villeneuve, known for his work on Arrival and Blade Runner 2049, mentioned that adapting Dune was a long-standing dream of his. Despite his doubts about securing the rights, his passion for the project gained the respect of Mary Parent, who hired him after hearing his vision for the film. But Villeneuve didn't rush into it. He took his time, first completing Arrival in 2016 and Blade Runner 2049 in 2017, using the experience from these films to help shape his approach to Dune. By early 2017, shortly after being nominated for an Academy Award for Arrival, he officially signed on to direct the film. He also brought many of his trusted collaborators from his previous films. These included editor Joe Walker, production designer Patrice Vermette, and visual effects supervisor Paul Lambert. But not everyone could join the project. Roger Deakins, Villeneuve's longtime cinematographer, had to step down and was replaced by Greg Fraser, who gave the film its distinct visual style. What's interesting is how Villeneuve's background in sci-fi and his collaboration with these key people deeply influenced the final version of Dune today. But if things had gone differently, imagine if someone else had taken the reins. Villeneuve's unique style, his emphasis on visual storytelling, the careful world building, and his slow burn approach to tension gave Dune a specific feel. But what critical decisions in the writing process shaped the Dune we see today, and how different could it have been? The writing of Dune played an important part in the making of this film. For starters, if he hadn't pushed for a two-part series, we would have seen a single rushed film cramming all the novel's intricate details into one movie. This would have likely stripped away much of the depth and complexity that makes Dune unique, turning it into a more generic sci-fi blockbuster. In Denis Villeneuve's Dune, the decision to tone down Arab and Islamic influences really shaped the film's universe. Originally, both the 1984 film and Frank Herbert's book dipped heavily into these themes, pulling a lot from Islamic terminology and Middle Eastern elements. This wasn't just a backdrop, but a core part of the story's DNA. But Villeneuve opted for a more neutral, expansive universe. Why the shift? Well, The original book and even the 1984 movie got some flack for how they handled these elements. Maybe it felt a bit like cultural appropriation or didn't quite hit the mark in representing these cultures authentically. Villeneuve probably wanted to avoid these issues by creating a setting that didn't lean so heavily on specific real-world cultures. He aimed for a broader appeal. This way, the story focuses more on universal themes like power and destiny, which anyone anywhere can get behind. It's a different take for sure, but one that lets the film stand on its own. Villeneuve's choice not to borrow from Lynch's or Jodorowsky's visions was another major turning point. If he had embraced Lynch's surreal style or Jodorowsky's radical ideas, the film would have been visually very different, perhaps more bizarre or experimental, rather than the grounded epic feel Villeneuve brought. And Villeneuve's choice to eliminate internal monologues also made a huge difference. If those had been kept, Dune could have felt slower and less engaging for modern audiences. Instead, he focused on more visual storytelling, giving the film a faster pace and more accessible tone. Now, Denis Villeneuve had a clear vision for the characters, especially Paul Atreides, the young heir to a noble family who becomes a central figure in the planet Arrakis' power struggles. The casting of Dune could have led to a totally different movie if some decisions had gone another way. Had the vision not been as clear, we could have ended up with a completely new cast, and with it, a very different feel for the film. Take Timothée Chalamet for example. Villeneuve knew from the start that Chalamet was his guy for Paul. He wanted someone with an old soul and a young body, and Chalamet fit the bill perfectly. But imagine if Chalamet hadn't been available or wasn't interested. Another actor might have made Paul seem too immature or tough, totally shifting the movie's tone. Chalamet's mix of vulnerability and wisdom gave Paul depth that someone else might have struggled to pull off. Then there's Rebecca Ferguson, who almost passed on playing Lady Jessica, one of the supporting characters in Dune. She felt the role was too much like her Mission Impossible character, and didn't want to get typecast as just another strong female character. If Ferguson had turned it down, the role could have gone to someone with a very different energy. Ferguson brought a balance of strength and tenderness to Lady Jessica. Still, with another actress, she might have come across as either too cold or too soft, changing the whole dynamic of her relationship with Paul. Zendaya, who plays Shani, was up against 5 other actresses for the role. Her chemistry with Timothée Chalamet, who plays Paul, was what sealed the deal. Shani is a strong and important character, a member of the desert-dwelling freemen and eventually Paul's love interest. If another actress had been chosen, that chemistry might not have been the same, making Paul and Shani's relationship feel less powerful. Since their connection is a key part of the story, this would have affected the film's emotional core. One big casting change Villeneuve made was turning Dr. Liet Kynes from a male character into a female, played by Sharon Duncan Brewster. This modernized the story and added a much-needed balance between male and female characters. But why did the design team reject typical sci-fi aesthetics and opt for something grounded in history? And how did that decision shape the world of Dune? The set design and costumes for Dune were a huge part of what made the movie feel so real. Patrice Vermette, the production designer, wanted to create realistic, immersive sets with minimal green screens. Imagine if they had used tons of CGI instead. Dune might have felt less believable, or like a typical sci-fi movie. By focusing on practical sets and real locations, Vermette made sure the audience could truly get lost in the world of Arrakis. And the Sandworms of Arrakis are a huge part of Dune's lore. And Villeneuve's team knew how important it was to get their look just right. They even waited until the very end of the first trailer to reveal one, because these creatures are that big of a deal. Villeneuve and his crew wanted the Sandworms to feel ancient, almost like they've been around forever. So they went for a more prehistoric interpretation. They took inspiration from whales, especially in terms of size and movement. In fact, they spent an entire year perfecting the design of the Sandworms to make sure they felt as massive and awe-inspiring as they should. Now, over 1,000 different looks were created for the film by costume designers Jacqueline West and Bob Morgan. Villeneuve wanted the costumes to feel grounded in history rather than the sleek, futuristic look that's common in sci-fi films. Imagine if the costumes had taken the typical futuristic route with shiny materials and high-tech designs. The movie might have felt less connected to the past and more like a typical space opera, taking the viewer out of the moment. One important character who didn't make it into Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 1 is Fade Routha. But why was this major role left out? And how does it change the dynamics of the film? In previous adaptations, like David Lynch's 1984 version, Fade, who was portrayed by Sting, is a significant antagonist. a cunning rival to Paul Atreides. But in this new adaptation, Fade is nowhere to be found. It seems like Fade's role has been partially blended into Dave Bautista's character Glossu Raven, who is also Baron Harkonnen's nephew. Raven is portrayed as the brute force, while Fade in the original story serves as the cunning, calculating counterpart. But Fade could still pop up in Dune Part 2. It looks like Villeneuve might be saving him for later, which could make things really interesting when he finally shows up. Maybe keeping him out of the first movie is a way to amp up the surprise and shake things up in the sequel. So we might just see Fade step into the spotlight later, bringing his cunning ways into the mix. Despite these changes, the film's release didn't go exactly as planned, leading to some frustration for Villeneuve. The release of Dune was a bit messy because the movie got caught up in the chaos of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was originally set to hit theaters on November 20th, 2020, but after a couple of delays, it finally premiered on October 22nd, 2021, almost a full year later. But that wasn't the only issue. What really changed the game was the decision to release Dune simultaneously on HBO Max. If this hadn't happened, we could have seen Dune make an even bigger splash in theaters, with audiences experiencing the full scale and visuals the way Denis Villeneuve intended on the big screen. Villeneuve himself was deeply disappointed by the HBO Max decision, as he believed that Dune was made to be seen in theaters, not at home. If things had gone differently, without the pandemic's influence, Dune could have made an entirely theatrical release, possibly drawing in larger box office numbers and creating a more immersive experience for viewers. Villeneuve's vision was designed for the cinematic experience, and without the HBO Max release, the film might have made an even more lasting impression as a theater-only event. Regardless, most fans would agree that the Dune we see today is one of the best sci-fi movies ever made. And the decisions made that shaped the outcome were all for the better. But what do you think? If you enjoyed diving into the world of Dune and want to see more exploration of your favorite movies, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.